Well, friends, welcome. My name is Stephen Fetter. I manage the United in Learning program for the General Counsel Office, and it is a privilege and a delight to be able to welcome you from across the country here. It's an exciting program that we have lined up for you, and we are so pleased that you're taking the time to be a part of this and are excited about the topic. Wanted to mention just a couple of technical things before I turn things over to Michelle Voss, who is our host for this evening. First of all, we're going to use the chat to collect your questions. Now, we've turned off the chat so that you can't chat to each other because that's distracting. So please be assured that Michelle and the panelists are all looking at the questions that come in, and they're going to curate them and sort of group them together. And as time permits, Michelle is going to pose the questions to the panelists. So be aware that the chat will work just a little differently than it does in some of our other webinars. And that's why, because we want to make sure we save enough time for the panelists to say what they need to say and give Michelle all the time she needs to do that curating. If you want to find the chat and you haven't found it already, move your mouse over the screen and all of those icons will come up at the bottom of the screen, including the one that says chat. And you can click on that. You type right at the bottom. Other than that, I wanted to mention that we've had a bit of a hiccup with resourcing the next program. We had intended to meet next Monday night, and our speaker can't come. We went back and forth for a couple of weeks about whether we should pre-record or whether we should move the date. And the trouble with pre-recording, of course, is that you never get the chance to ask questions. So we finally decided that we are going to move the date, and I hope that's not inconvenient for you folks. That was a last minute decision on Friday, and we thought rather than sending out emails, we should tell you tonight. So don't come on Monday night. There will be nobody here, but come on Wednesday night instead, and it should be a bang-up program. So other than that, if you have technical questions or concerns, put them into the chat and I'll answer them. If you've got questions of substance, put them into the chat and Michelle will curate them. And I'm going to turn things over to her right now. Michelle, over to you, and glad you're here.
Thanks, Stephen. Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Voss. I'm a United Church of Canada minister and also professor of theology and past principal at Emmanuel College in Toronto. So I'm coming to you tonight from Emmanuel College. I'm also a member of the Theology, Interfaith, and Interchurch Committee. And through that work, I serve as well on the Countering Anti-Semitism Working Group. And so I want to offer some thanks, first of all, to Executive Minister Jennifer Janzen-Ball, who's a panelist, for supporting this work in her role, and to the General Counsel for mandating the work of kind of animating our resources around countering anti-Semitism. Thanks also to Stephen Fetter and United in Learning for supporting the series. And I also want to say a special word of thanks to Emmanuel College and the Center for Religion and its Contexts, who provided financial support for tonight's session. This series is a very special collaboration among members of United Church of Canada theological schools. And so I'm very grateful to the schools that were able to make this work a priority in this busy time, and especially to Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan from Vancouver School of Theology, another panelist tonight, who's been key to planning this whole thing and is going to participate in multiple sessions. On a personal note, I'm drawn to the work of countering anti-Semitism and Christian anti-Judaism from a couple of angles. And I imagine that if you're here, you may have similar kinds of stories. My scholarly expertise is in religious pluralism and interfaith work, but not with Judaism specifically. But my Jewish students at Emmanuel College have shared what it's like for them to be in a school with a long Christian heritage. And in my many years of teaching the Introduction to Christian Theology course, and I've got a lot of my students here tonight, good to see you, I have witnessed and I continue to witness students' theological misunderstandings relating to Judaism and also to the Hebrew Bible. And then I'm also learning from a dear friend who's a Jewish anti-racist activist who keeps teaching me about the diversity among Jews and also about her frustrations that Christians don't seem to understand our responsibility for anti-Semitism. Christians in our context seem to have the privilege of delaying or deferring our responsibility to self-educate and speak out. So for the next few weeks, we'll be holding space to learn and think. This webinar addresses anti-Judaism, which begins early in Christianity as writers tried to distance themselves from mainstream Judaism. Even after Christianity became a separate and well-developed religion, the anti-Jewish teachings remained in the New Testament and other early writings. And those are still taught or and this is why we need a series like this. We may need to understand them in a different light. Anti-Judaism is related to, but different from the modern European idea of anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism, as the negative stereotyping of Jews and Jewish beliefs, has contributed to anti-Semitism, including the destructive acts of vandalism and physical violence toward Jewish people and communities in history and today. In this series, we won't be talking about the cultural phenomenon of anti-Semitism directly, but mostly about anti-Judaism, which we already begin to see in parts of the Christian Testament, as I mentioned, and has carried through in Christian preaching, worship, and hymnody. Anti-Judaism includes, for example, the idea of supersessionism, which says that the Jews were rejected by God and replaced by the church. It singles out some Jewish leaders as the killers of Jesus. And there I'm quoting from Bearing Faithful Witness, which you'll hear more about tonight. Now, if you're interested in exploring definitions of anti-Semitism, you might consider attending an online event next week through Emmanuel College. And I'm just going to post that in the chat for you because that's a place to go if that's a conversation that you want to have. So Christians have a responsibility to be aware of anti-Jewish tendencies in our worship and our thinking, to do our own internal work so that we don't bear false witness against our Jewish neighbors. Session 2 will focus on how Christians engage the Hebrew Bible, and Session 3 will discuss how anti-Judaism can appear in interpretations of the Newer Testament. Much of the content of this series will be drawn from Bearing Faithful Witness, which is a study produced by the United Church in 1997, and we highly recommend it for use in your congregations and your theological schools. Our session today is going to provide a context for these other sessions. It's going to give an overview of United Church Jewish relations in the past. It's going to share about recent General Council activities, and it will also share recent developments in grassroots dialogue. This overview is important because what we do in worship doesn't happen in a vacuum. The complexity of our context increases the urgency of our responsibility to be aware of what we say and do with our sacred texts. You all know that we are doing this work in a time of heightened awareness of violence in Israel-Palestine. This webinar was actually in planning for a couple of years before the current war. Anti-Judaism also predates the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by about 1800 years. The United Church is not changing its position, which is that it supports the Palestinian people and it opposes anti-Judaism. Both are parts of our anti-racist commitments and our commitments to justice. Multiple commitments can exist side by side. So for conversations about Palestine, we recommend that you look at recent United Church of Canada statements, the work of NJAPI, which is the United Network for Justice and Peace in Palestine and Israel, and also the witness of our Israeli and Palestinian partners. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first presenter, the Reverend Dr. Bruce Gregerson. In 1994, Bruce Gregerson was appointed as Interfaith Secretary in the Division of World Outreach of the General Council. In 1995, that position was merged with what they then called Area Secretary, responsibilities for South Asia, the Pacific, and Middle East. This involved Bruce in staff leadership in the Interchurch Interfaith Committee and major interfaith projects, including support for bearing faithful witness and United Church representation to the Canadian Christian Jewish consultation, as well as direct involvement with Middle East issues, relationships with Palestinian partners, and as member of the Interchurch Middle East Working Group. In 2003, Bruce moved to a senior leadership role in the church as General Council Officer for Programs for Mission and Ministry. In this role, he remained the spokesperson for the church in controversies related to Israel and Palestine, and continued through most of his time as a member of the Canadian Christian Jewish Consultation. He also served as lead staff and writer for the working group that presented the major report on Israel-Palestine to the 2012 General Council that resulted in the dissolution of the Canadian Christian Jewish Consultation. After retirement in 2015, Bruce served in an interim role as senior advisor for theology and faith and was involved in a range of projects, including full communion and mutual recognition of ministry agreements and the One Order Remit. Through a McGeechee Scholarship, Bruce is completing 2 books entitled Creatively and Redemptively, Reflections on the Interfaith Journey of the United Church of Canada, and A Question of Anti-Semitism, Israel-Palestine, and the United Church of Canada Jewish Relations. So I think you'll agree that he's an excellent person to begin our overview. Bruce.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm glad to be taking part in this. It was an intense piece of work for about 25 years of my life. And I work with a great deal of sadness in the final outcomes of the ending of the Canadian Christian Jewish Consultation, or at least that initial withdrawal of CJA from the consultation. You'll see running through the presentation that I'm making that kind of connection to CJA that will come to the Canadian Christian Jewish Consultation that will be coming up again and again. And of course, that also relates then to bearing faithful witness and how bearing faithful witness interacted with a number of major events in Israel-Palestine issues for the church and in Jewish-Christian relationships. I served on CCJC, just to get the short term right, the Canadian Christian Jewish Consultation, for about 20 years, 22 to 23 actually. There are many places that Jewish-Christian dialogue takes place in Canada. Many of you probably are on different dialogues. After the ending of the Canadian Christian Jewish Consultation in 2012, many of those places continued. So as I speak about the end of that formal relationship between the National United Church of Canada and the Jewish community, particularly the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs in the later years, but then also the Canadian Jewish Congress, it's not to say that there aren't many other places where that dialogue continued and now still continues to take place. So let me share my screen. And let's go to the origins, to how we got into bearing faithful witness. And I think you'll know from the context of the report itself that it grew out of a petition from Alberta Northwest Conference in 1988, dealing with the blatant anti-Semitism of Jim Keegstra and his teachings to his public school classes that the Holocaust was a fabrication. And that petition in 1988 resulted in the Interchurch Interfaith Committee giving some significant thought over a number of years to how to respond to the petition. And it did so by, first of all, issuing a statement and then appointing a national task group. That task group is composed of a number of people that I'd want to just highlight. Clint Mooney, I think, is on the call, and Clint was one of the key editors and writers of the document. Bill Phipps the late Bill Phipps, a former moderator of the church, Fritz Voll, a German theologian who contributed substantially to the content, and in his period, in the time that he was active, substantially to a Jewish-Christian dialogue in North America. Don Coutts, the chairman, Linda Payne, and Carolyn Pogue Phipps. And I'd also want to mention Karen Hamilton, who chaired the Bearing Faithful Witness Steering Committee. All right. And I don't know why I'm not getting there we are. Sorry. So the Interchurch Interfaith Committee, appointed in 1992, the task group, but asked, first of all, affirmed in its response to the petition that it wanted to emphasize the continuation of dialogue with the Jewish community in Canada. And they particularly mentioned the Canadian Christian-Jewish consultation. They also indicated that it was really important that it include divergent positions, including the justice and security of all the people of Israel, including those in the occupied territories. And it laid a critical foundation of Jesus as a Jew as the basis for relationships with Judaism. So it appointed the task group to prepare a guidelines paper to help identify and contextualize anti-Judaisms, and that guidelines paper is what we know as Bearing Faithful Witness. Now, it was a lengthy project. To the 36th General Council in 1997 for approval, back out for further consultation in the church. Significant consultations that took place with the Jewish community, with ecumenical partners, with churches around the country, back to the 37th General Council in 2000, and finally to the 38th General Council in 2003. Now, Bearing Faithful Witness offered significant foundations for our relationship with Judaism. And I've highlighted a couple of the main ones here, but these weren't unique to the United Church. Nostra Aetate in 1965 really is seen as beginning the whole context of understanding that the church does not replace the people of God as of Israel. But I don't know of any other document until the time that Bearing Faithful Witness came out that so comprehensively brought everything together in one key component policy statement that was adopted by a church. But I think that the real foundational work that Bearing Faithful Witness does is not these kinds of statements, although they're absolutely critical to any kind of work towards anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism itself, but rather the foundational work that Bearing Faithful Witness did on Scripture and the use of Scripture. So by moving beyond a promise and fulfillment motif to the stories of Christ that recapitulate the Hebraic stories, catching up the promises of God as newly revealing the content that Jewish brothers and sisters already saw within them, and then understanding Jesus as first and foremost a Torah-observant Jew. And that allowed us to interpret many different passages in ways that Jesus was seen not as seeking to abrogate Jewish tradition, but rather calling Jews to a more faithful interpretation of their own tradition. Now, the only other document that comes close to Bearing Faithful Witness, I think, is a sacred obligation by the Christian Scholars Group. 10 statements of that sacred obligation document published in 2002, I think pretty closely mirror just about all that Bearing Faithful Witness was dealing with in its foundational statements. I think that it becomes a way of understanding how Bearing Faithful Witness, which again was written in 1997 and before, I think contributed to a much larger witness throughout the world. Now, there were numbers of responses to bearing faithful witness. The Jewish community itself called it a gem. I think that's the language that I've heard repeatedly around bearing faithful witness. There was significant support in many other places around the country and beyond the church. But there were a few that I just want to mention that identified some concerns. And one of them had to do with the language of our basis of union, Article 2.7, that we believe in and confess the Lord Jesus Christ as the only mediator between God and man. And so it goes right to the heart of the question of salvation, that people, a number of people, and a number of formal petitions that came forward at that time challenged. Now, the petition, one of the petitions, or actually there was a number of them because they coordinated their presentation or their sending of petitions to General Council, called for Article 2.7 to be rewritten to say we believe in and confess the Lord Jesus Christ as a mediator between God and man. The petitions didn't pass General Council. They were referred to the General Secretary and then on to Interchurch Interfaith Committee. And that left the committee writing this text that you see in the document at the beginning that affirms that the understanding of the church is that bearing faithful witness is consistent with the basis of union of the United Church of Canada. Now, a further area of a challenge to the document came around the language of the covenant of God with Israel as irrevocable. And it had more to do not with the theological context of that, but rather with questions being raised about the connection of land and covenant. And I'll come back to this in a bit because it becomes a central part of the journey of the church, of course, around bearing faithful witness and around anti-Semitism. And the challenges about that understanding of an irrevocable covenant, which by many in the Jewish community includes a land and a commitment of the land to a people, the Jewish people, irrevocably given by God. And so what we see in the document is also a statement that the church, the state of Israel, has the right to exist in peace and security, and then a footnote that is added that refers to that statement by saying that the 1967 borders of Israel are historically what the church has accepted as delineating the land of Israel. Of course, many Jewish colleagues would profoundly disagree with that, as they would also see a greater Israel, which includes Judea and Samaria. Bearing faithful witness was the first of 3 documents, and it stood on its own. We didn't know that anything was going to follow it, but fairly quickly, a document on Muslim United Church relationships followed, and then a number of years later on Hindu United Church relationships. But there was a common framework that each of those subsequent documents drew from bearing faithful witness. And this is one way of understanding it, which I think actually offer markers for United Church principles of relationship with other faiths. And I think these 6 were actually phrased in a series of paragraphs in the 2 following documents and are implicit within bearing faithful witness, provide something of the of a consolidation or a way of understanding the significance that each of them made to our journey as a church in understanding other faiths. Now, I'm not going to say much more about the content of bearing faithful witness. I believe that's going to be the content of a number of other sessions, and there are others who can speak more directly and clearly to that. But I'm trying to set a historical context of how bearing faithful witness was part of the life of the church at its time and what happened afterwards. But we have to go back. We have to go back to a fracture that happened. Anybody who knows the history would know that, of course, what we're talking about is A.C. Forrest, the editor of The Observer, in the 60s and 70s. Now, between September 1968 and June 1969, which of course is right after the 67 war. Forrest spent 10 months in the Middle East and again another month in May of 1970. And he was editor-at-large for The Observer during that time. But he also wrote for a number of US church magazines, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, the Lutheran churches, as well as a secular press. He had a powerful voice in Canada, and he was almost alone in that kind of role as a senior editor and a writer in defending the Palestinian cause. And of course, his book, The Holy Land, kind of marked that significant voice in Canadian society. It was a bestseller. The story is that at some point, Coles, because it was being picketed, because it had the book, withdrew the book from circulation, and then they were picketed by even more and larger groups because they did that. And finally, it was brought back in. Went through, I think, 5 printings. And this is a quote from the book that just points out and how perceptive, I think, Forrest was of the realities of what was emerging on the ground after the 67 war and the occupation of the beginning of the occupied territories. That, of course, wasn't all that he did. There were significant publications in the Observer that many saw were crossing a line of appropriate to inappropriate anti-Semitism. The Booth article, in which the title of it was "How Zionists Manipulate Your News," was a key problem for many in the Jewish community, and it actually led to a lawsuit between B'nai B'rith and Forrest and the Observer. So finally, the General Council Executive intervened, tried to work through an agreement with B'nai B'rith on the difficulties that existed. And signing that agreement, this is kind of a famous photo with Bruce McLeod and George Morrison and representatives of B'nai B'rith signing that agreement. Haim Genesi, one of a number of writers on that time, because there were multiple studies and papers and books written about the tensions between the United Church and the Jewish community at that time, used a phrase that stuck. And that phrase was, this group met in secret. And that kind of language has carried forward into our own, and this is just a bit of an aside, into our own United Church conspiracy space. Because the understanding from a number of people is that the agreement that was signed by the church and B'nai B'rith at that point still has a life in the church. That somehow it gets carried on, and it's what's prevented the church from doing all that it should be doing in people's ideas in support of the Palestinian cause. And I think Jennifer might be able to reflect later on, even in the last number of years, we still get letters into the General Counsel office saying, repudiate that agreement. We know it still exists. And as somebody who has been involved for 25 years in direct leadership of this work, I can tell you I haven't even seen the agreement. But conspiracy theories carry on their own life. Bruce McLeod, by the way, shared with me at one point his dismay over this, because he said, we met at Franz down the road from the United Church office. Alan Davies, a church minister, but one of Canada's leading experts in anti-Zionism, wrote this for the appendix to Bearing Faithful Witness about Al Forrest. Others have said that he had a more prophetic role, but this was, I think, also a fair analysis that he crossed lines and ultimately needed to acknowledge that some of the things that he was involved in not appropriately anti-Semitic. So we're going to jump ahead. Between that agreement that was signed in the 1970s, we moved into a time of of turmoil. We know the number of wars that took place. But in terms of United Church action, after Forrest died tragically and unexpectedly in 1978, there wasn't a whole lot of action that took place. But 2000, it was just at the time of the start of the Second Intifada. Suicide bombings were beginning to become more common. And the General Council, through the Justice and Global Ecumenical Relations Unit, issued a statement. And this statement, this is only part of it, but this statement is seen by numbers of people as signaling a turn in relationship. It called on the government to protect Palestinians. The chair of CCJC at that point, Jim Ball, the United Church minister, resigned. His argument was that this violated an understanding that had been existing to that point. And so it is kind of a transition point in the church's engagement with Palestine, Israel-Palestine, that marked that kind of shift. Roy Tannenbaum, Rabbi Roy Tannenbaum, who was a part of the original, who supported the original writing team in Calgary, was part of consultations, a member of the CCJC, wrote with much dismay after this statement was made. This statement to both Bearing Faithful Witness Steering Committee and to the Interchurch Interfaith Committee. And you can see the dismay in his writings over this direction. So that began a series of tensions and trouble for the Canadian Christian-Jewish consultation, mostly centered around the United Church. In 2001, after that statement was released, there were negotiations about whether we could continue meeting as a consultation. There were some agreements that were set in place that suggested we could, but it was tenuous. And then we moved into 2003. And there were a number of resolutions related to Israel and Palestine to the General Council at that point. One of them had to do with recognizing the emergent state of Palestine and calling, and this was a significant commitment on our part to put this in, calling on the Arab state of Israel's to acknowledge Israel's right to exist within safe and secure borders. But we also had the context at that meeting of a conversation that I took part in the CCJC meeting about that particular phrase that you see before you, and a mention from Jewish colleagues that it would be much stronger if it could say Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state within safe and secure borders, a Jewish state. Chris Ferguson and I, who were attending the meeting as representatives from the United Church, took that back, and we did propose it, and it was accepted. The resolution, though, added a further statement, which is what allowed us to say it, that in addition to recognition of the emerging state of Palestine and other neighboring Arab states of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state within safe and secure borders, that we also add the recognition of Israel and Palestine of equal citizen rights and protections and privileges and responsibilities of all their respective citizens, regardless of religious or national orientation. So this then is the year, and this is the context in which Bearing Faithful Witness came to General Council. Proposals for a Jewish state that our interfaith guest from the Jewish community, Dov Marmer, spoke to, strongly supported. The presentation of Bearing Faithful Witness, which Dov was able to say was warmly welcomed across the Jewish community. And then, for the very first time, the mention of the possibility of divestment, which Dov indicated was clearly a challenge for the Jewish community. And that issue of divestment or economic action on against Israel and against particularly settlement products carried through into a number of additional meetings. In 2009, it came to a head with a number of proposals around support of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. There was significant press at the meeting. The Jewish Defense League picketed the General Council offices as well as the meeting itself. And what happened at that meeting was at least a step towards saying that we will encourage members of the church and organizations and congregations to seek an end to the occupation by participating in limited economic boycotts. But it wasn't a national boycott, and that was tested on the floor. It was an invitation. And there was also at that meeting an invitation to undertake a review of all past policies. And that then led us into the working group in Israel-Palestine in the next 3 years. And those 3 years covered a huge amount of ground. The Kairos Palestine document was released in Bethlehem. The opportunity to be there for that release and to speak to the gatherings. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement increased dramatically with participation from a number of churches around the world. And then, of course, our report was released May 1st in 2012, and it created a firestorm across the country. Intense lobbying, protests, economic actions, about economic action and boycott. We were clear in the report that we were proposing a limited economic action. We did not propose a boycott of Israel. We did not in any way propose divestment at that point. But the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which had just recently replaced the Canadian Jewish Congress, at that point, I think needed to earn its space in the Jewish community, and so attacked us and significantly used it as an opportunity to question any relationships with the United Church of Canada. And ultimately, what we did is we produced a resolution that that actually called for economic action against settlements. Now, I'm going to draw to a close. What happened after that meeting is that the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs withdrew from the Canadian Christian Jewish consultation, ended the consultation effectively. There was one actual meeting that took place in July of 2013, in which there was an attempt to reconvene, and the actual participants of the meeting felt that we had a way forward and proposed a way forward to the board of CJA. And CJA said, no, we're not prepared to do that, and offered some criteria for how they would come back. And I think Jennifer is going to talk about that in just a moment. But I'd like to close with just a quick reflection on anti-Semitism, because one of the realities that I faced in this whole journey was trying to walk a line between care for relationships with the Jewish community, of which I was involved in numbers of different expressions of, and care for Palestinian partners. And I think trying, as we all were, to try to be sensitive to not crossing a line of anti-Semitism. Definitions, well, then it gets into the question of which definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance or the Jerusalem Declaration. I think the Jerusalem Declaration is what the United Church has chosen to accept. In some ways, I also think that the IHRA definition is worth paying attention to as a way of understanding, and it's also the most universally accepted one, as a way of understanding what anti-Semitism is. And as I look at that, I will say frankly that as a United Church, what is worth examining in our part is the issue of double standard, which is a foundational part of the IHRA definition. Are we more directly involved with Israel and Palestine than in any other situation in the world? I think I have an answer for that. I have given answers to it as I've been asked at various points, having to do with global partnerships and history of relationships. But I think it is the issue that we do have to pay attention to around the question of anti-Semitism. But I would share this one little statement that I have at various points shared in meetings, and in particular with Jewish colleagues, and that is, if the limited focus on settlement products was considered to be unacceptable, and by some parts of the Jewish community as anti-Semitic, it raises the question: what nonviolent actions are open to those who support Palestinians that are not anti-Semitic? So I'm just going to leave it like that and turn it over to Jennifer, who I think will continue on.
I will introduce Jennifer. So Bruce, having concluded with some personal reflections on definitions, it is such a tricky matter and one that's highly contested. And so again, even though we're not as a group settling on any definitions here today, you might want to consider continuing that conversation at the other event that's coming up at Emmanuel College next week that I put in the chat. So that's there to continue that particular conversation. Now, Jennifer, the Reverend Dr. Jennifer Janzen-Ball is lead staff for the United Church's Theology and Interchurch Interfaith Committee, and also relates to United Church Theological Schools. She and her colleague, Adele Holliday, jointly provide staff support to the Countering Anti-Semitism Working Group, which is a group made up of elected members from TICIF, that committee with a long name, and also from the Anti-Racism Common Table. And of course, we here at Emmanuel are very proud that Jennifer holds a PhD from Emmanuel College. Jennifer?
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, Bruce, for the lead into what I will share, which picks up where Bruce left off in terms of some of the more current history, and then into what has brought us to the Countering Anti-Semitism Working Group and this webinar series. So I will just share my screen. Here we go. So as Bruce said, in 2012, the Canadian Christian Jewish consultation basically dissolved. And then, as he also noted, in 2013, there was a series of meetings and communications between both CJA and the Canadian Council of Churches, which had held the Canadian Christian Jewish consultation. And this resulted in a set of requests from CJA in 2013, to which member churches were unable to agree. So I'll put the 4 points show them for you here. It was the 4th point in particular to have the member churches of the Canadian Council of Churches have their national leadership oppose resolutions of economic action against Israel or the settlements as they would arise in their synods, conferences, etc. That was the most problematic for the member churches of the Canadian Council of Churches. And I should say that earlier on, the United Church had offered to step away from the CCJC, but the member churches of the Canadian Council of Churches also did not want that to happen. And then when this set of criteria was proposed by CJA, the 4th point in particular was considered to be problematic. In the fall of 2018, the governing board of the Canadian Council of Churches also held an internal discussion on Christian and Jewish dialogue. So that was with its own member churches. It wasn't with the participation of anyone from any particular Jewish organization or the Jewish community. The general consensus was that there was interest in a national dialogue, but some real uncertainty about who the dialogue partner or partners might be and for what purpose. There was also a kind of generally expressed desire to learn more about what was going on at a local level to try and create a more creative framework for a national dialogue. Meanwhile, the United Church's General Councils in both 2015 and 2018 continued to receive proposals from conferences at the time around just peace in the Middle East. And there continued to be and still is no national ecumenical Christian-Jewish dialogue. In fact, at any national or continental dialogue is really restricted to broader tables such as Canadian Interfaith Conversations and the North American Interfaith Network. As Bruce noted at the beginning, dialogue really does continue to happen most often at the local level, and Rabbi Laura will be speaking more to that later in our time tonight. So I want to fast forward then from 2018 to 2022. Early 2022, I had just started in this role, and the 44th General Council was set to begin online in February. The practice for all General Councils has been to invite both interfaith guests and Canadian and global partners to participate as corresponding members, so with voice but no vote. I was asked to see if I could find a Jewish guest, preferably a rabbi, who would be willing to accompany the General Council over its meetings the next 7 months, all online. And this was felt to be particularly important because a National Just Peace Task Group had been working for the last 4 years and had brought forward a report for information and a proposal for the General Council. In addition, a number of the regional councils had brought forward proposals around Palestine and Israel. Obviously, United Church-Jewish relationships on a national level remain quite strained, but I knew some United Church people engaged in local interfaith work, and so I reached out for some help in approaching some rabbis. After a bit of work, we were connected to a staff person at CIJA, Mr. Richard Marceau, and Rabbi Alan Finkel in Winnipeg, who was involved in interfaith work. And both of them accepted our invitation to be guests at the General Council. Of course, I was aware that the proposals before General Council on Palestine and Israel were likely to be contentious. We have members who are engaged in human rights work for Palestinians and Israelis, and members who are engaged in interfaith dialogue. And often these are different groups of people, and each are passionate about the relationships that they have, and are also passionate about the challenging impact that United Church statements and lack of statements have on their relationships in each of those contexts. I was also mindful of, as Michelle has said, the anti-Judaism residing in the roots of Christianity, and that is still present in the United Church, and so was conscious of the need to be continuing to counter anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism within our own theological, liturgical, homiletical, and faith formation practices. I've heard anti-Jewish scripture texts read aloud in United Church worship services and haven't heard preachers address those texts. And I've worked with ministry students early in their theological education who I think unknowingly, unconsciously have parroted some supersessionist phrases about differences between the Old Testament and the Newer Testament. And I was privileged to be a guest at General Council in 2003 when Bearing Faithful Witness, the statement was adopted. And I found it quite compelling in its call to the United Church to address anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And so for 10 years when I was teaching, I had assigned Bearing Faithful Witness as regular required reading for students. So I say all of this because I was aware for the prepared for the possibility of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish remarks being made during a learning session for General Council in April 2022. I thought, prepared to interrupt and name it. What did happen, however, I was unprepared for. One person's mic was unmuted, and they did not realize that it was. And while Richard Marceau from CIJA was speaking about one of the proposals, this person uttered an obscenity and questioned why he was speaking. The comment was experienced by both our Jewish guests as anti-Semitic. I immediately apologized, the moderator immediately apologized, and called the incident unacceptable. In subsequent days, church leaders met with our two Jewish guests and repeated the apology. And the moderator and general secretary met with the person who had uttered the phrase, and that person also apologized. Later in the month, commissioners and corresponding members also met online to share their experiences of that learning session. Given the presence of anti-Semitism within the church and anti-Arab and anti-Muslim prejudices in church and society, and the increase and ongoing increase in hate incidents against Jews and Arabs and Muslims, the church really does need to be attentive and take action. As a denomination, we've committed to becoming an anti-racist denomination, and this includes addressing anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinian racism, and Islamophobia. So out of our awareness of these realities and the incident at the learning session, a proposal was brought to General Council to ask that the National Church engage in education and awareness raising about anti-Semitism within the United Church to ensure that all members of the church were engaged and equipped to counter it. And we named our resource Bearing Faithful Witness, which at that point in time had been available to the church for almost 20 years. And I think that many people were unaware that it was a resource that could be drawn on. And so we wanted to lift that up again and base the work of the Countering Anti-Semitism Working Group on Bearing Faithful Witness. And so, as Michelle had mentioned, a working group was established and has been meeting since early February 2023. Since then, we've done a number of things. There's an introductory web page and a frequently asked questions document. There are some new and revised blog posts. So we, particularly for Advent and Lent, those are seasons in the church year that we often hear anti-Judaism text read. And so we had previously asked people to write some blog posts to address those. And so those have been revised and some new blog posts have been written. And the links are there. We can post them on ChurchX later. There's been some work done in the 40 days of engagement on anti-racism, hymn review with the group that is producing our new hymn resource, Then Let Us Sing, and most recently the creation of a Good Friday worship service, which should be posted soon on the United Church website. And of course, this webinar series in partnership with United Church Theological Schools. As the Countering Anti-Semitism Working Group has gone about its work, we have also heard questions of what about? What about anti-Palestinian racism? What about Islamophobia? These are very important questions and issues that the church needs to address. And our mandate from the commissioners at General Council is really clear. The work of the Countering Anti-Semitism Group focuses on helping United Church people become aware of and address anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, particularly within our own denomination. We encourage everyone to speak up against all these forms of injustice, but our work is not to address anti-Palestinian racism or Islamophobia. I know that the challenge of holding multiple commitments. There can be significant tension amongst these commitments and amongst those in the United Church who are passionately engaged in justice, in interfaith work, in interfaith dialogue. And I think some of the challenge in this particular area is that all too often anti-Semitism and the situation in Palestine and Israel are conflated. They're not the same issues, and conflating the two together does serious disservice to both justice issues. I think one of the challenges that we continue to wrestle with is that there's an ongoing, albeit often unconscious, desire for a kind of binary either-or approach rather than a both-and approach. And I think I want to recognize that at the heart of these tensions often are relationships. We care about those we are in dialogue with, and we care about those that we are seeking action for justice with. We care about our friends and neighbors' experiences of anti-Semitism, of anti-Palestinian racism, of Islamophobia, locally and globally. And so those relationships, I think, amplify the tensions that we see within the church. I wanted to highlight an important point from Bearing Faithful Witness about critique of the actions of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism, and Bruce kind of drew on this earlier in his presentation. But in Bearing Faithful Witness, there's a statement that said, since attacks on the state of Israel can arise readily from anti-Semitic motives, some persons have argued that Christians, at least, because of our highly compromised past, should refrain from criticizing Israel at all. But this position is untenable, although Christians must take special pains not to forget this past and its ideological legacy. As a modern nation state, Israel, like all nation states, is subject to the moral ambiguities of power, which by definition is never innocent and can never be innocent. And Bearing Faithful Witness goes on to say that legitimate criticism concerns itself with policies and actions on the part of the government, as well as enduring problems and tensions in Israeli society, and that legitimate criticism is always able to distinguish between a regime and a people. And so I wanted to name that because I think it's a really important challenge as we're navigating these multiple commitments in the United Church, and as we're engaging people again in conversation about anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism within the church itself, to highlight once again that critique of the actions of states is not anti-Semitic, nor is it racist. Before and after October 7th, the National Church has made statements about the need for just peace in Palestine and Israel, underscoring international human rights laws and obligations, and our partners' calls for just peace in the region. We continue to engage members in advocacy in this area, particularly with the current conflict that is happening. And the work of the Countering Anti-Semitism Working Group continues. So we continue to hold to our commitments to stand up for justice, for human rights, to work for peace. The reality of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the church and wider Canadian society doesn't negate our ongoing commitment to Palestinian and Israeli partners working for peace, justice, and human rights. We continue to hold multiple commitments. And so this work to address anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and to work for just peace in Palestine and Israel are really part of the church's ongoing commitment to equity and becoming an anti-racist denomination. And so I'll end here and turn over to Michelle to introduce Rabbi Laura.
Thank you, Jennifer, for catching us up to the very present on these relationships. I'm delighted to introduce our last panelist for tonight, who is Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan. Rabbi Laura is an interfaith activist and scholar, and she is the director of interreligious studies at the Vancouver School of Theology. With her multi-faith colleagues, she has collaboratively written books on reconciliation, interfaith friendship, and encountering the other. Rabbi Laura, a popular speaker, has won multiple awards for her teaching of religion and philosophy. She is also a former synagogue rabbi, a great lover of all kinds of animals, and the author of the book, Mouth of the Donkey, Reimagining Biblical Animals.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Bruce and Jen and Stephen. I'm really honored and excited to be here and to be part of this series, bearing faithful witness forward in a more Zoom-embodied kind of way. as I listen to Bruce and Jennifer, I'm really struck by two things, and I'm struck with sadness about those two things. One of them is that a rupture with one particular Jewish organization has led to so much rupture between United Church members and the Jewish community. And I'm also saddened to see how much can be lost when we try to start dialogue around the most difficult issues around which people have very, very strong feelings that they bring to the table. Sometimes stronger feelings that make it difficult to engage the more reasoned parts of ourselves. So I want to start with a story, a bit of history, and then I want to talk about productive examples of Jewish-Christian dialogue, many of them actually involving CIJA, the organization that has been challenging for the United Church to maintain ongoing relationship with. This is the story of my very first experience with Jewish-Christian dialogue. I was about 6 or 7 years old, maximum. I am out for the afternoon with my mother. My mother was an athlete, and this particular afternoon, she was playing tennis with her friend Dorothy McCarthy, and Dorothy had a daughter, Mary, who was about my age, and our parents would often drag us along to the park and make us play together by courtside. We played very well together. One day, Mary, again, we're 6, maximum 7 years old, Mary blurts out, "The Jews killed Jesus, you know." And I blurt out, "That's impossible. I don't even know who that is." As if I, at age 6, never heard of it, nothing could possibly, right, be real. And then, being as we were 6 or 7 years old, I remember very clearly the next thing that happened, which was we reached into the cooler and took out a bottle of chocolate milk to share. But had we been much older, and had either of us had any idea of what we were talking about, we might have found ourselves in a very difficult spot that we could have addressed productively, or could have been the catalyst for us to each go our separate ways. I will be talking a little bit about how great it is to start dialogue in less challenging issues and then proceed to the more challenging ones. But first, let me share my screen. I am not really sure if I actually need to show this slide and share the information on it, because both Bruce and Jen talked about how Jewish-Christian dialogue is happening in many, many different ways between different groups, different local organizations, different individuals. But I will give this information anyway. And this is incredibly oversimplified. I want everybody to know that at the outset. Jews have been here on our great island that some of us call North America since the first Europeans came. The earliest Jewish settlers in Canada came in the 1700s and the 1800s. They tended to come from Western Europe, that is mostly England and Germany. And when they arrived as Jews and gathered into small communities, they tended to create synagogues and use the synagogue as the focus of their religious life, their cultural life, and their source of mutual support. By the late 1800s and the early 1900s, we had new waves of Jewish immigration into North America. These were people who mostly came from Eastern Europe, who came fleeing anti-Semitism and poverty. Many of them, due to their time and place, were socialists. And when they came and met one another and formed communities around their extended families, they tended to create workers' circles, mutual support of proto-unions. Some actually grew into unions. And the center of their cultural and social life and life of mutual support was these workers' circles. In approximately the 1930s, the synagogue Jews from Western Europe and the workers' circle Jews from Eastern Europe had a significant political split, particularly around which side to support in the Spanish Civil War, nationalists or socialists. And each group continued to grow its unique institutions, schools, cultural organizations, mutual support organizations. World War II, the Holocaust, the Cold War turned more public opinion away from socialism and toward synagogues as a center of Jewish life. The CJA organization and other major organizations that are the big players on the national scene in Canadian Jewish life come from this synagogue side of our early history in Canada. And they tend to work primarily with synagogue groups. And I should add that since the 1950s, there are many different players on the Canadian Jewish scene. We've had different waves of immigration. We have people who cross these two boundaries. But what has happened to the groups of Jews that did not buy into the left side of my slide? They are all still here. They have alternate organizations. Some of them go to synagogue. Some of them don't. Some of them participate in CJA. Some of them don't. We Jews follow the same overall demographic as Canadians when it comes to religiosity. That is, about a third of us participate in religious institutions. About a third of us do religion our own way and come to synagogue when we want to or need to, usually around entering or exiting relationships, birth, marriage, death. And 1/3 of us want absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with our major religious organizations, and we simply identify ethnically. So I want to point out that there are many, many different circles of Jews who participate in dialogue with many, many different kinds of social, cultural, political views. I'm an example of someone who doesn't really fit these categories. I came from the United States. My family came from Eastern Europe, but I am a synagogue-going Jew, and I'm also someone who does my own thing when it comes to organizations and Jewish-Christian dialogue. I teach at a Christian seminary, the Vancouver School of Theology. One of the denominations we serve and support is the United Church. So I spend a lot of time with United Church people, in particular, future United Church ministers. And I've been doing this for about 10 years, though my association with VST goes back to 7 years before I started working there. On this slide, you'll see a number of things, or rather images, representing a number of things that when I tell my students that this is part of Judaism, they are surprised. They don't know. They think it's fantastic and wonderful and amazing. And sometimes they say, we want to bring more of this into our spiritual practice. And I'll just say what the different images represent. I'll start in the upper left-hand corner and go clockwise. Jewish festivals. We follow an earth-based calendar. We celebrate every season change. We follow the cycles of the moon in counting the months of our calendar. We key our Sabbath and our other holy days to the hours of sunrise, the hours of sunset and dark, not to the clock, but to the cycles of the world around us. And so if you practice, you have kind of an earth-based rootedness in the world, which gives you a great foundation for re-engaging with land and ecological and climate issues. We have, on the next image, the candles. We have very detailed rituals of support around grief. A whole script for the community to support anyone who is in mourning for the entire first year of mourning and beyond. And people really show up for that. We have been relatively progressive on LGBT issues since about the year 500, where the extreme right-wing position in Judaism has been don't ask, don't tell. That is not the ideal position, but it is the one that appears in Jewish tradition 1,500 years ago as, what should I say, the right-wing position. Nothing's going to happen to you, but in case it does, stay closeted and live your life. I'm not bragging on the position, but I am pointing out that that is the conservative position, and everything else is left of that and has been for 1,500 years. When it comes to God, you can think or feel or believe anything you want to. And if you're an ordained clergy person, no one is going to quiz you on what you believe. Your relationship with God can change over a lifetime. Jews have lived in almost every country of the world, corner of the globe. There is no one Jewish race. There is no one Jewish ethnicity. Jews look all different ways and speak all different kinds of language. When we read our scripture in synagogue, we chant it musically, and that brings a deep emotional dimension to what we do. We have a open-ended and creative and fun tradition of biblical interpretation. We may have fundamentalism about how one observes Shabbat, but we don't have any fundamentalism about how one reads scripture. And then, of course, on the left, the one thing our students do usually know about is that we have a very highly developed mystical tradition that makes use of all kinds of spiritual modalities to deepen our relationship with the divine. And I don't know exactly why our students, all of whom are boldly interfaith engaged, I don't know why our students don't know this, but I think that in many ways, it may be because of the lack of engagement in recent years in Jewish-Christian dialogue in the church communities. But here are some things that have been going on recently in the United Church in the Pacific region. And I should add that CJA in the Pacific region does a little bit of its own thing. For example, it did not end the Jewish-Christian dialogue until shortly before the pandemic, and even then continued outreach to Christian communities in different ways, some of them less threatening. This is an example of an event that did not attempt to discuss the most difficult issue, the schismatic issue of Israel and Palestine. I did not go to it, but I heard it was a wonderful event, and I did watch the video that this is a screenshot from. This is an interfaith Passover Seder. It was sponsored by the local Multi-Faith Action Society and CJA, and it was hosted by the Canadian Memorial United Church Center for Peace. And as you can see, children and musicians are featured prominently in this video. It was an attempt to share spiritual practice in a lighthearted and fun way. And the way it was set up, Christians were hosting Jews, hosting Christians. So there was really a cycle of welcome and fun and mutual responsibility for the event. And given the nature of the event and the child-centered nature of the event, it was appropriate to participants to keep it on this kind of lighthearted level. The young man playing the clarinet is a student at the Vancouver School of Theology. His name is Ben McCrae. He works at St. Andrew's Wesley United Church, and he is hoping to be ordained a United Church minister. Ben went on an interfaith dialogue fellowship, and as part of the fellowship, he had to create a community project after the conclusion of the fellowship dialogues. And he chose, drawing on his experience at the Fun Seder, he chose to create or co-create a Jewish Christian Day of Friendship hosted at St. Andrew's Wesley United Church. It was a full day of events. People could attend the whole thing, or they could pick and choose what seemed most interesting to them. The morning, what is here represented as interfaith worship service, was really just the regular United Church service in the morning with Jewish guests and a cameo appearance welcoming some Jewish clergy. After that service was a presentation by CJA, where they explained their mandate and their views on Israel and opened themselves to challenging questions that could be asked, which they asked with consciousness of their dual responsibility as representatives of an organization with a particular mandate and a particular message about the state of Israel that they needed to put forward. They tried to balance that with their own personal views, and by all accounts of people who have spoken to me, did a good job of speaking honestly and setting their boundaries, but in a way that welcomed at least hearing challenges to their view. The rest of the day, 4 o'clock, jazz vespers, really we got together and listened to music together and had a little dialogue about music and our traditions. And the evening service was the contemplative chanting service co-led by a Jewish cantor and the members of the church choir. It was quite beautiful. And you can see in this one day a whole progression of interfaith activities. The morning, simply sharing a spiritual practice or being a guest at a spiritual practice, then going into difficult things, and then just decompressing together, listening to music from it, and in the end, coming together, in a sense, into the presence of God in a different, wordless way. Something different, and it's not a typo when I say 2023. When I say 2013, this did happen in 2013, but it was such an interesting experience for me that I wanted to highlight it as a great example of dialogue. This happened at the Naramata Retreat Center of the United Church in Naramata on the shores of Lake Okanagan. It was a week-long workshop that I co-led with an Anglican priest, Dr. Donald Gregerson. It was a week-long workshop, 3 hours a day. We call it a Jewish Christian interfaith experience. Now, to be fair, the Jews who come to Naramata Center are the people who identify as Jewish who come to Naramata Center are either Jews who are part of Christian families or Christians who are part of multi-faith families. And we spent a week having the gentlest, sweetest dialogue that you could have. We talked about questions like, what does it mean to you to be Jewish? What does it mean to you to be Christian? What is your relationship, if any, with the Hebrew Bible? What is your relationship with any, if any, with the New Testament? How do you personally understand prayer? What does that have to do with your experience as a member of a tradition? And we looked at together at some of the parables in the New Testament that have been used to convey anti-Semitic messages from time to time, and looked at them in multiple ways from multiple perspectives. And then it came the second to last day, and Don said, Laura, we have to discuss Israel and Palestine. And I said, you really want to blow up all the beautiful stuff we've accomplished this week? And Don said, trust me, it's going to be good. And Don introduced the topic to our group in this way. He asked each person to talk about the very earliest ways they can remember that they were introduced to issues around Israel, issues around Palestine, or knowledge of the conflict. That's it. We talked about earliest memories. Some people were raised as Christian Zionists. Some people were raised as Jewish Zionists. Some people never gave it a thought until they were middle-aged social justice activists. That was it. We just listened to one another. There was no mandate to come up with a group statement. There was no mandate to set up a future dialogue. There was simply being together and listening. And through that, we were able to see how we all come at the issue in very different ways. And we were able to be comfortable with that because we had laid the foundation earlier in the week of talking intimately about other kinds of religious and spiritual issues. Relationships like that are built over a long period of time make it possible to come together for events like this. This was an event that I co-created with Shadia Kupti, who is the second person from the left, who works at Trinity Grace United Church as the social justice coordinator. Shadia is a graduate of Vancouver School of Theology, where I was her thesis supervisor, and we were able to come together for an event where we spoke and sang on the themes of lament, healing, hope, and peace. It was not an event where we made any accusations, but it was an event where we acknowledged that we were broken-hearted and feeling powerless and at a loss, and that this would be the space of brokenness that we would enter together and come together for prayer. I really do not know if this was the first event of its kind, not a political protest, but a prayer service in our region, but we think it might have been. It's a small sanctuary. The sanctuary was full. It was clear that people were craving opportunities like this to come together in prayer. I just want to close by referring to a little schematic for interfaith dialogue created by my friends Imam Jamal Rahman, Pastor Don McKenzie, and Rabbi Ted Falcon. This is their model of 5 stages of interfaith activity. You move beyond separation and suspicion. You inquire more deeply. You share both the easy and the difficult parts. You move beyond safe territory, and you explore spiritual practice from other traditions. I do not use the model in as linear a way as they do. I think we can enter interfaith activity by inquiring more deeply. We can enter by sharing spiritual practice. It depends on whether we are head people or heart people primarily. But one of the things that I learned from them was if you want to productively move beyond safe territory, you very much need to engage in some of the other parts of collaborative sharing. Now, I am not saying that if you are a national organization whose job it is to advocate for a particular position, that you can necessarily use this effectively. It may be that your mandate to advocate for a particular position precludes some of these aspects. But if you are not in that role, if you are a member of a small organization or a member of a friendship circle, you can absolutely do these things. And the relationships and the dialogues that we create at the grassroots level will be really where we live and the ongoing relationships that we'll be able to have to even bridge and rethink some of the most difficult legacies of our traditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Laura, for helping us to conclude our webinar tonight on a note of hope and starting at the grassroots level, where these kinds of conversations and bridge building and peacemaking together can happen. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but there is one from the chat that perhaps you, Rabbi Laura, would be good to tackle, or any of the panelists before we close out, which is given the ongoing work of bearing faithful witness, in place of goals, what might we consider to be markers of quote unquote success as we move forward, of growth and practices of longevity? So how do we know if it's successful?
That's a great question. I may not be the right person to answer it, but I will say that a marker of success for me is when I feel welcomed in a church, and if difficult texts happen to be in the lectionary, that these are either approached by the preacher in a historical or contextualized way, or they make themselves available for dialogue afterwards around these difficult issues. So when I see more consciousness in the places where people are receiving their religious education, and sometimes even in children's curricular materials, I've had experiences with that. Those are times when I, as a Jewish person, feel that the work of bearing faithful witness is being done.
Thank you. I'll also just share a slide of that is actually the final slide of this presentation, of other things that may be signposts for the ongoing nature of this work. This is there are lots of lists like this, and so there's some links there to the Dialogue Institute. But perhaps when folks show up and are able to live into these kinds of ways of being in relationship to one another, those are also signs that we're succeeding. These aren't easy things to do in the moment, and those can also be maybe some touch points to say, like, are we living into the best practices of these kinds of relationships? Well, our time has come to an end tonight, and I am so grateful to the panelists, to Stephen for facilitating and hosting this on ChurchX. By the way, this session is being recorded and will be available on ChurchX for those of you who registered. We'd also like you to encourage folks to go ahead and register, because because they can still attend the next two sessions and also view this one on Church X. So again, I'd like to thank the three panelists for your personal experiences, your engagement with us today, your expertise, and your commitments to dialogue and peacemaking. I'm going to turn things over to Stephen now for a very final word with some things for all of us to keep in mind as we move forward in this series.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you to each of the panelists. What a thought-provoking and rich evening it's been, and I'm so grateful. Wanted to remind you all that we are not meeting next Monday night. We've had a hiccup with our leadership. We're meeting next Wednesday night. So don't come on Monday. We won't be here, but come on Wednesday. Don't miss it. It'll be exciting and dynamic and as rich as tonight has been. And I hope you'll enjoy it. Also wanted to remind you that the ChurchX page is a place where we can capture resources. And so as the speakers have been speaking tonight, I have been posting things at our ChurchX page, and you may want to go back there and find all of these resources for yourself, just so that you can see what you need to see. You can find the Bearing Faithful Witness study document, the Countering Anti-Semitism resource page, a bunch of other links here, including these blogs that Jennifer invited you to look at. So they're all there at the ChurchX page. Go and have a look at them at your leisure, and I will send out an email reminder probably tomorrow morning as soon as the recording is posted, so that we'll direct you back to the recording here, and also all the folks who had to miss the first one tonight, make sure that they can come too. So thanks again, and looking forward to being with you next Wednesday night. Bye for now.